They found the bones scattered near the tree line, small ones, soft as chalk, wrapped in scraps of a dress that hadn't belonged to a child in decades. The dogs refused to go near. Their ribs showed beneath their fur, their eyes sunk deep with fear, as if they remembered the scent. When the wind shifted, it carried something else too, not rot, but the faint sweetness of smoke and milk. The sheriff said the bones weren't recent, that the ground had given them up on its own, as if the mountain had grown tired of keeping its secrets. But the locals knew better. They said the soil in that part of the ridge was greedy, that it swallowed generations whole, only to spit them back up when it wanted to be remembered. For nearly a century, people had whispered about the holler that didn't end, a stretch of land in the Appalachian folds where no road dared go straight. Maps refused to stay accurate there. Paths shifted overnight. Some said it wasn't a place at all, but a loop, a pocket of time that forgot to move forward. And within that loop, there was a family, a bloodline that refused to end. They lived without census, without graves marked, without God. Some say they never spoke English right, just a thin, humming language made of breath and teeth. When they came down from the mountains for salt or medicine, they walked in groups, barefoot, their skin a shade too pale, like something that hadn't seen sunlight since before the war. And yet, every few decades, when someone disappeared into the ridge, a traveler, a surveyor, a missionary, a story would surface. About a house made from old railroad wood, about laughter that sounded wrong, about a woman who looked 20, but called herself grandmother. Which city are you watching from, and what time is it right now? It matters, because this story doesn't belong to 1 hour or one place. It unfolds the same way it did 100 years ago, in the cracks between time and hunger. If you trace your finger across an old Appalachian map, past the coal scars, past the mining towns that no longer have names, you might find a faded ink blot labeled Marrow Hollow. It was once a settlement, though no record proves it. The name appears only in the margin of a 1907 forestry survey, half erased, as if the cartographer had second thoughts. That's where the bloodline began, before the mines came, before the roads were carved, before the outsiders called the mountains theirs. They say the first of them was a woman, born of fever and salt, left by a dying mother in a cave by a stream. The locals called her the Hollow Bride, and from her the rest came, pale, quiet, untouched by time. No one knows her real name. The Hollow Bride. That's all she was ever called in the journals of passing traders. In the hand, scrolled reports of missionaries who tried to find her people and never returned. Some said she was born in the 1830s. Others swore she lived long before that, before there were boundaries or deeds or God-fearing men in pressed coats. She lived by the river that vanished underground, where mist hung like breath, and the trees grew too close together. People who saw her said she was beautiful, but not in a way meant for men. Her face looked carved from candle wax, and her eyes held a stillness that made them forget what they'd come to say. She had a scar across her collarbone, deep and long, as though someone had once tried to open her and see what kept her alive. By the time the Civil War came to those ridges, her descendants already numbered more than 20. They lived in cabins built without nails, roofs thatched with mud and pine needles. None of them married outsiders. None of them left the hollow. Every birth was said to be marked by silence. No crying, no wailing. Just a long pause, as if the air itself was waiting for permission to move again. The children grew fast, spoke late, and walked long before they could form words. By 7, they hunted. By 12, they gave birth. And in the stillness of the hollow, the seasons turned wrong. Snow in summer, blossoms in frost. The stream ran red some years, thick as rust, and always the same sound at night. Not a howl, not quite a song, more like humming through teeth, rising from the caves below. In 1911, a government surveyor named Elias Brandt tried to find Marrow Hollow. His last entry reads, "Voices under the soil. Small hands in the trees. I don't think they know what they are." He vanished a week later. All they found was his compass, melted at the edges. Those who live near the ridge say the bloodline learned early that the world would never accept them. Their bodies were marked. Eyes too close together, skin too white, tongues that moved like broken mirrors when they spoke. And yet, they were proud. They said they came from no man's sin, but from the mountain itself, born of its rot and its silence. And once, when a woman from the nearest town tried to visit, to give them flour and blankets during a long winter, she came back changed. She cut her hair off, stopped speaking to her husband, and 2 months later, she was pregnant. The child she bore would not cry. Its mouth opened wide, its chest rose, but no sound came out. The midwife said its tongue looked wrong, too small, too pale, like it had never learned how to touch language. They called him Abel, though the mother never used the name aloud. She kept him locked in the attic, away from mirrors, away from light. Neighbors said she had gone mad, that she walked barefoot through the snow at night, whispering lullabies into the dark. Her husband left soon after the birth. No one saw him go. They said she buried him behind the barn, but when the sheriff dug, he found nothing, only an old rusted pail filled with milk teeth, each one too large to belong to a single child. When Abel turned 5, he vanished for 3 days. Searchers combed the woods, found his tracks leading straight into the ridge, then stopping. No drag marks, no animal prints, just a sudden end, like the earth had swallowed him. On the morning of the 4th day he returned. His clothes were clean. His skin was cold. He wouldn't speak, but he carried something in his hand, a piece of cloth, frayed and brown with age, embroidered with a single word in thread the color of blood: bride. After that, the mother stopped opening her door. Smoke never rose from the chimney again. When the sheriff forced his way in that spring, the house was empty. Except for one thing, dozens of small handprints covering the walls, pressed in suit, climbing toward the ceiling. The town called it hysteria. They said she'd lost her mind after the boy disappeared. But the older folks whispered that she'd been claimed, that the bloodline from the hollow had come back for what was theirs. By the 1920s, Marrow Hollow had become a forbidden name. Hunters avoided the ridge. Preachers refused to mention it from the pulpit. Children were told not to wander near the river that vanished underground, where the wind carried a sound like breathing. And yet, every decade or so, someone saw them, thin figures moving through the fog at dusk, barefoot, carrying jars that glowed faintly from within. Some said they were collecting light. Others said they were gathering blood. The few who dared to look closer noticed something strange. The faces were all the same. The same eyes, the same mouth, the same calm expression that didn't belong to any age. One old woman, last of the Brandt family, said she knew what it meant. They aren't dying, she told a journalist in 1954. They're repeating, like a word whispered too long into the dark, until it stops meaning anything. And deep beneath those hills, where the soil never froze, something ancient and breathing waited, remembering every name it had ever swallowed. By the mid-century, The mountains were quieter than ever. Coal towns emptied, the last trains pulled away, and the ridge was left to its own silence. Yet the stories did not fade. In every nearby town, the old men at the general stores still spoke of them. The ones who came down only when the moon was wrong. The ones who traded nothing but bone charms and jars of something that looked like honey, but smelled like iron. It was said they were led now by a child who had never grown up, a girl with eyes so pale they reflected everything and revealed nothing. They called her Mercy, though no one could say if she had been born or made. Her hair was white even when she was small, and she walked barefoot through snow that refused to melt around her. Those who met her claimed she spoke in fragments, in old words that didn't belong to English. When she touched your hand, you saw faces you didn't recognize. A miner once said he saw his mother, his sister, and his wife all looking back at him from her eyes, and he never returned to the shaft again. By then, the government had begun to notice the disappearances. In 1958, a social worker named Margaret Vale was sent to investigate reports of isolated families living in the interior hollows. Her notes were brief, clinical at first: 6 dwellings, no birth records, no schooling, limited language comprehension. But the final entry, found in her abandoned jeep, was different. They share one face, one voice. They speak of the bride as if she never died. They say she walks still. The next spring, children began finding small bundles washed up in the creek, cloth wrapped around hair, teeth, and bits of glass. The sheriff burned them all, but new ones kept coming. Always 3 at a time. And then there was the church bell. It rang one night in '62, long after the church itself had collapsed. People woke to the sound drifting through fog, heavy and slow, echoing off the ridge like something alive. When they followed it, all they found was the old foundation, and in the center, a pile of folded clothes, still warm. Locals said it was the bloodline reclaiming one of their own. Others said it was the hollow bride calling her children home. The few who ventured near the hollow after that spoke of symbols carved into the trees, spirals that bent inward until they vanished into a single point. Hunters claimed the forest was shrinking from within, that paths no longer led where they once did. Some began to wonder if the family was even human anymore. But one man did not wonder, he believed. A genealogist from Raleigh, sent in 1972 to collect data for a state archive project. His name was Dr. Howard Lark. He found their records, or what was left of them, and in doing so, tore open the wound the mountains had tried so long to hide. Dr. Howard Lark arrived in the Appalachians during the spring thaw of 1972, carrying little more than a notebook, a reel recorder, and a letter of authorization from the Department of Cultural Preservation. He was not the first man to seek the truth in those ridges, but he was the first to bring the arrogance of science into a place ruled by silence. Locals warned him off, of course. They said maps changed there, that compasses spun wild, that even the birds refused to fly over Marrow Hollow. He smiled politely and kept walking. He said he didn't believe in curses, only patterns. And that was his mistake. He set up his camp near the old Brant property, the last known site connected to the Hollow's settlers. For 3 days, he recorded nothing but wind and the sound of water moving underground. On the 4th night, the reel captured something else, a lullaby. It was faint, sung by a woman's voice that seemed to come from the earth itself, low, slow, and in a language he couldn't place. When he played it back, the recording warped. The air thickened, and the trees seemed to lean closer. He noted in his journal, voice consistent with female. Tone suggests repetition or mimicry. The next entry, written in a shaking hand, simply read, "It knew my name." By the second week, Dr. Lark found what he called the Ledger of the Hollow, a bound volume of parchment pages, water-stained and ink, faded, buried beneath the floorboards of a collapsed cabin. Each page listed names. No dates, no places, just names repeating over and over again. But something about them was wrong. The same 5 names cycled endlessly, rearranged in new orders, as if generations had been built from a handful of original souls that never truly died. He traced the lineage back as far as he could and realized the truth. Every mother had been her own grandmother. Every child, their own ancestor. The bloodline had folded in on itself so many times that identity had become circular. Birth feeding death, death feeding birth, and at the center of it all, one name never changed: Bride. That night, he woke to the sound of footsteps around his tent. Bare feet on wet leaves. He called out, but no one answered. The next morning, he found handprints pressed into the canvas, small, smudged, burned at the edges, as if the fingers had been made of ash. He wrote one final line before the journal ended: "They aren't a family, they're an echo." The mountain keeps saying their names until something answers back. When searchers found his camp weeks later, the tent was torn, the tape reels melted. Only the ledger survived, half buried in the mud. And for years afterward, when the wind turned cold at night, people near the ridge swore they could still hear his recorder playing. A woman's voice whispering through static, singing the same word again and again: Bride. The ledger found in Lark's camp was stored for years in a university archive, mislabeled and forgotten. Mold crept along the pages, ink bled into the fibers, until the words blurred into veins. Only in 1984 did anyone open it again, a graduate researcher named Ellen Morrow, who was cataloging unverified Appalachian genealogies. Her notes began like any other field report: neat, detached, professional. But soon, her handwriting changed. Repeated name patterns, same 5 individuals spanning 150 years. No generational separation. The term bride appears in every 10th entry, sometimes alone, sometimes doubled. She kept going. Some pages smell of milk, some of iron. There are small stains, shaped like fingertips, but smaller. Within months, she became obsessed. She visited the ridge that summer, ignoring the locals' warnings, ignoring the way they refused to say the name Marrow Hollow aloud. She carried a Polaroid camera and her copy of Lark's notes. What she found, she never told anyone directly. But the photographs she left behind tell their own story. The first is of a stream. Clear water, stony bed, ordinary. The second, same stream, but darker. Shapes beneath the surface, like faces pressing up from underneath. The third, an old wooden house, barely standing, its door sealed with rope made of hair. In the final photograph, taken the day before she vanished, she's pointing toward a hillside cave. Her face is calm. Her shadow behind her is not. It bends the wrong way, as if the light itself had refused to touch that place. Her roommate said Ellen would wake in the night whispering names. Not hers, not anyone she knew. She'd repeat them like prayers, over and over, until dawn. The night before she disappeared, she wrote a single line on the wall above her bed in charcoal. She's not dead. She's divided. The cave she found has never been located again. Some hikers claim it shifts each year, that the mountain closes over its mouth like a wound healing itself. But sometimes, after rain, a smell rises from the soil there, a mix of wet stone and something sweet, almost like spoiled milk. Those who've been close enough say they can hear something deep below, like water or breathing. And when the wind turns, they say it carries a voice. Not screaming, not singing. Just the quiet murmur of a mother telling her child to sleep. But there's no child anymore. There never was. Only the blood, speaking to itself, over and over, generation after generation, refusing to end. The towns nearby no longer mention the hollow. It isn't on maps. It isn't on deeds. But when you stand at night near the ridge, you can see faint lights moving through the trees. Slow. Patient, like lanterns searching for someone who still remembers their name. And if you listen long enough, you'll realize the sound beneath the wind isn't a lullaby at all. It's counting. By 1987, the name Marrow Hollow had vanished from every surviving map. The ridge itself was sealed off under the guise of landslide risk. But people still went missing. Hikers, hunters, a pair of surveyors who followed the wrong path at dusk. Every disappearance was quiet, every report half-hearted. The locals stopped asking questions. They knew what waited in those woods. That same year, a television crew from Atlanta tried to film a documentary about Appalachian folklore. The tapes were never aired. Only one cameraman made it back. His name was Dennis Kane. And the few sentences he managed before his death are now preserved in police transcripts. It wasn't people anymore. It was one thing, walking on 24 feet. When they found the remains of the crew's camp, the tents were intact, the cameras untouched, but the tapes had been stripped of their magnetic coating, blank, glossy, empty as bone, and yet, something persisted. Those who entered the ridge swore the trees seemed closer together each time they blinked, their roots tangled like veins around unseen bodies. The ground hummed faintly, as if the mountain had learned to breathe. A few months later, a new researcher appeared, funded quietly by a private foundation that didn't sign its name. His name was Dr. Rowan Hilt, a linguist specializing in isolated dialects. He wanted to prove that the Hollow Bride's descendants were merely a lost linguistic enclave, human, not haunted. But what he found was language that moved like a disease. Words that repeated themselves until they no longer had meaning. He recorded a child reciting their family hymn, a pattern of murmurs that rose and fell like prayer. When he slowed the tape, the words became English. They were names. The same 5 names Lark had written in the ledger. Every variation was a rearrangement. Abel, Mercy, Clara, John, Bride, a cycle without end, each one feeding the next, until identity itself collapsed into a single note, the hollow sound of belonging to no one but yourself. Hilt's final entry read, language folding in on itself, names cannibalizing names. This is not preservation, it's reproduction without origin. They found his tent 3 miles outside the ridge. Inside, the tape recorder was still running, though the reel had long since ended. The sound it made wasn't static, it was breathing. From then on, locals said the bloodline had stopped hiding, that they'd grown tired of being legend. Travelers saw their figures in the fog at dusk, pale, slow, moving, always carrying something in their arms. Not tools, not children, just mirrors. And in those mirrors, people swore they saw their own faces, older, smaller, wrong. Even now, some nights, people near the ridge hear a bell ring once, low and soft. The sound never echoes. It just hangs there, waiting for something to answer. In 1991, a man named Peter Hall moved to the foot of the ridge. He was a quiet man, an amateur historian who'd spent years collecting oral folklore from the coal country towns that time forgot. He had read Lark's notes, and Morrow's too, and said he only wanted to set the record straight. He rented a small house by the river, the same river that vanished beneath the earth, where the hollow was said to begin. His neighbors said he was polite, if distant. He walked the ridge trails every day, always returning before dusk. Until one evening, he didn't. When they searched his home, they found his journal open on the table, its last pages filled with cramped, sleepless handwriting. He traced something, some kind of symbol, over and over again. A spiral, 5 points circling inward, collapsing on themselves. His final entry read, "They live through repetition. Each child is born remembering the last birth. I saw them, not faces, reflections. Every window showed someone behind me." The next morning, the sheriff followed his trail up into the ridge. It ended at the cave, the one Ellen Morrow had found before him. The entrance was sealed again, this time not with stone or wood, but with skin. Thin as parchment, stretched tight between the rocks. When they cut it open, the air that escaped was sweet, like honey turned sour. Inside they found carvings, hundreds of them, each the same symbol, the spiral, the 5 names, etched into the walls until there was no space left. And beneath the carvings, bones. Too small, too many. Some shaped like hands clasped together, fused by time and pressure. They closed the cave after that. No reports, no photographs, no mention in the papers. But those who helped seal it swore the ground pulsed beneath their boots, as if something inside had started to wake. 3 of those men later took their own lives. The 4th burned down his house. The 5th, the sheriff, disappeared with his family one winter. The neighbors said they saw lights moving through the woods that night, like candles being carried in a procession. Afterward, the ridge was declared off limits. Signs went up. Fences followed, but people still heard the voices, low, rhythmic, familiar. Mothers claimed they heard their own children calling from outside their windows, long after the children were asleep. In the years that followed, even satellite images failed. Every photograph of the ridge came out wrong, stretched, blurred, the forest folding in on itself like an old wound refusing to close. No one goes near now. But still, the air carries whispers, names repeated softly, endlessly, as though the mountain itself is trying to remember what it once was. And somewhere, deep below, the bride waits, patient, unrotted, dividing herself again and again, birthing new echoes into the dark soil. It is said that the hollow never ended. It simply moved deeper, beneath the roots, beneath the rock, until it became the marrow of the mountain itself. The bloodline did not die, it became the pulse of the earth. In 1998, decades after the last search party, a new excavation began farther east, an unmarked mining operation funded by a private corporation. They were after rare minerals, they said. What they unearthed instead was a door, not wooden, not metal, something in between, like petrified bone carved flat and sealed smooth. Behind it, the air was warm, wet, and faintly humming. The workers who broke it open lasted less than an hour before one began speaking in a voice that was not his own. Soft, rhythmic, wrong. Another started bleeding from the nose. The foreman tore up the work orders and sealed the site. The company denied it ever happened. But one photograph survived. It shows a narrow tunnel lit by the workers' headlamps. On the far wall, 5 figures, painted in some dark, glossy substance, holding hands in a circle. Above them, a word scrawled in long, looping script: bride. A journalist who traced the event in 2003 found that every man from that crew had the same dream before their deaths. Walking through a forest that never ended, where every tree whispered their names backward. By the time the ridge was declared a conservation zone, even the maps refused to align. GPS would spin endlessly there, like a compass caught between 2 poles. Those who entered said the sound of breathing never stopped, that sometimes it seemed to come from beneath their own skin. And at night, under a thin moon, the forest glows faintly. Not fireflies, not light, just a soft, sick shimmer, as if the soil remembers every face it has ever consumed. No one dares go there now. But every few years the bones rise again, unearthed by rain, carried down the streams, found tangled in roots, pale, perfect, still warm. DNA tests always fail. The samples erase themselves, as if refusing to be named. The last man who tried to sequence one of them said the pattern wasn't human, not animal either. It was recursive, folding inward, building itself infinitely, like a family tree with no beginning and no end. When asked what it meant, he only whispered, "It's still reproducing." And maybe that's the truth of the hollow, that the bloodline never wanted to survive us. It wanted to become us, to spread quietly, patiently, through marrow and dream and silence, until none of us could tell where the mountain stopped and where we began. So tonight, if you hear your name whispered softly against your window, don't answer. Because it might not be calling to you. It might be calling through you.